In the history of cinema, every decade has inevitably seen the rise of a particular genre or subgenre. At one point, westerns were riding high, only to be declared dead for good several times over the years. In the 1970s, spy films and all kinds of detective stories dominated the box office. The 1980s marked a golden age for science fiction, and nearly all major studios in Hollywood and Europe started producing sci-fi films. The 1990s were the age of action films. In the 2010s, comic book films took the lead. But that doesn't mean audiences only watched films from these genres, ignoring everything else. While spy movies and sci-fi dominated Hollywood, teen comedies had a rapid rise in the late 1970s, died out by the mid-1980s, and made a comeback in the early 2000s, and just as quickly disappeared again. Parody films followed a similar pattern. They burst onto the scene in the 1980s, vanished in the 1990s, and briefly resurfaced in the 2000s. Alongside comic book films, movies about teens fighting the apocalypse tried to break through, but they couldn't stand up to the major players and soon slipped into obscurity. But today, let's talk about Peplum, or sword and sandal films, which stepped into the spotlight in the 1950s and reached their peak toward the end of the decade. When adjusted for inflation, many of the hits from that era would now occupy half of the spots in the top 10 highest-grossing films of all time. Most of them have long been forgotten, but some of the hits from those years are still remembered. The rise of Peplum films is often associated with the development of television in the US. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, TV sets were becoming increasingly common in households. Theater attendance dropped sharply, and Hollywood needed something that television couldn't offer. Historical films, especially Peplum epics, helped Hollywood stand out from television. Panoramic shots and massive crowds became a hallmark of Peplum films. Television simply couldn't offer viewers that kind of scale. The rise of sword and sandal films wasn't immediate. In the early 1950s, many of them failed or brought in only modest earnings. In the mid-1950s, Alexander the Great and the Egyptian both flopped. Julius Caesar and Helen of Troy had modest runs, but around the same time, The Robe and its sequel Demetrius and the Gladiators became massive box office hits. Their combined budget was $10 million, and they grossed over $60 million in the US alone. In today's money, that would be equivalent to approximately a $120 million budget and a $725 million box office. In 1956, The Ten Commandments was released in the US. At the time, it was difficult to calculate net profits and actual box office earnings. Movies sometimes played for years and were re-released multiple times. Some theaters in the US even had to buy screening rights. That's why there are no records of how much specific films earned in those theaters. All we know is the number of tickets sold. However, The Ten Commandments had a budget of $13 million, a record-breaking figure at the time. In today's money, that would be around $155 million. Over 3 years of release, the film grossed $150 to $170 million. According to reports, at one point The Ten Commandments even surpassed Gone with the Wind, which held the record for highest box office gross at the time. Thanks to multiple re-releases, Gone with the Wind quickly regained the top spot. But according to the Guinness World Records, second place unquestionably belonged to The Ten Commandments. According to their data, the film would have earned over $2 billion today, adjusted for inflation, and would rank among the top 5 highest-grossing films of all time. However, the triumph of The Ten Commandments didn't last long. Once Hollywood studios noticed the film's success, budgets for Peplum films went up, and scale quickly became a top priority for filmmakers. In 1959, Ben-Hur was released in theaters. MGM originally expected the film to cost $7 to $8 million. However, the budget soon increased to $10 million, and by the end of production, Ben-Hur had become the most expensive film in cinema history. Today, it's believed that the studio spent over $15 million on it. The film is surrounded by countless myths and legends, some of which include truly wild figures. For example, many claim that 50,000 Italian extras took part in the crowd scenes, and 15,000 appeared in the chariot race scenes, as if the entire population of every Italian village had taken part in the production. But these numbers have often been disputed, with lower estimates suggesting that 10,000 people participated in crowd scenes and 3,000 in the chariot sequences. On top of that, there was a revolt among the extras who wanted to rise up against the wealthy American producers who believed that the workers should be grateful just for being able to witness the work of professionals. Additionally, the production was marked by the deaths of stunt performers in the chariot race sequences. Most of the rumors surrounding the film have been repeatedly debunked, yet they continue to resurface. As with the Ten Commandments, it's hard to say exactly how much Ben-Hur earned at the box office, but according to official estimates, it grossed $165 to $170 million, securing a solid second place behind Gone with the Wind at the time. Naturally, after such massive success of Peplum films, Hollywood started greenlighting more and more projects. The stars of the time who appeared in these films kept setting new salary records, while production budgets continued to rise to astronomical heights. European filmmakers didn't fall behind and were mass-producing sword and sandal films as well. The Italians were especially active in this field, but when it comes to box office numbers, these films simply don't have any. In 1960, Spartacus hit the big screen. It was a fairly troubled production, and many credit its success largely to actor Kirk Douglas, who also worked on the film as a producer. Although he tried to keep everything under control and even personally hired a 30-year-old director he hoped to quickly get along with, things didn't go quite as planned. When the film was completed and shown to the studio executives, the only person who liked it was the 30-year-old director Stanley Kubrick. However, he was quickly shown the door and the studio ordered everything to be redone. Douglas agreed that the film wasn't working, so the studio allocated $1 million for reshoots and additional filming of Spartacus. The crew then went to Spain, where they shot several battle scenes that hadn't been in the original cut. The new version of the film satisfied everyone, and Spartacus was released in theaters, where, according to various sources, it grossed $90 to $100 million on a final budget of $12 million. However, this film also exposed a problem. In the US box office, it earned only $30 million. The filmmakers followed the example of Ben-Hur, whose producers spent more on marketing than on its production. But with Spartacus, this strategy backfired. As a result, the studio added marketing costs of $13 to $14 million to the $12 million production budget. Given the total expenses, the film needed domestic earnings of around $45 to $50 million, but it only made $30 million. The international release stretched over decades. In many countries, Spartacus was sold for a set price. This meant that the studio and producers didn't receive any income from the box office in those countries, no matter how successful the film was. In other regions, royalties only started coming in after 5 to 7 years. In any case, although Spartacus eventually earned back its money and made some profits years later, it initially disappointed many in Hollywood and caused losses for the studio. As a result, American film companies started canceling some projects and trying to reduce budgets for those already in production. Meanwhile, the $10 million sword and sandal film, The 300 Spartans, completely flopped at the box office. The expensive Italian-American film Barabbas, directed by Richard Fleischer, the same director who later made the sequel to Conan the Barbarian and Red Sonja, also sank without a trace. Then came a movie that many believe destroyed the Peplum genre. Although Cleopatra didn't fail as spectacularly as many other sword and sandal films, it had an astronomical budget for its time, which was the main reason for its failure. Even today, when a $200 million budget is no longer considered extraordinary, the cost of Cleopatra still seemed truly monumental. $44 million in 1963 would be around $466 million today. According to the Guinness World Records, the film starring Elizabeth Taylor held the record for the highest production budget until 2007. Only Gore Verbinski's third Pirates of the Caribbean managed to dethrone Cleopatra. Even then, estimates suggest that in 2007, Cleopatra would have cost $299 million, while the third Pirates film was $300 million. In other words, the gap was only $1 million. However, it's important to keep in mind that such calculations provide only a rough estimate and aren't entirely accurate. Today, a movie featuring crowds as large as those in Cleopatra or Ben-Hur would cost much more due to numerous factors that have emerged in filmmaking over time. When production first began, Cleopatra's budget was supposed to be just $12 to $14 million. That's around $130 million today, about the level of Oppenheimer or Dune. Of that, $1 million was meant to go to Elizabeth Taylor, But as often happens in Hollywood, things went wrong once shooting started. First, Taylor got seriously ill, and filming had to be postponed for almost a year. By the time she was finally ready to film, some sets had collapsed, others had deteriorated, and some were lost, forcing the crew to rebuild nearly everything from scratch. But that wasn't the worst part. Filming was pure chaos. At one point, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, who played Mark Antony, suddenly decided they were meant for each other and began divorcing their previous spouses. All this generated unwanted negative buzz around the project. People were more interested in the divorce and its details than in the film itself, which many had already started to forget about. As production kept dragging on, Fox brought in a new director, hoping someone could finally take control and bring order to the chaos on set. As a result, the movie ended up with 3 directors. One of them, 2-time Oscar winner Joseph L. Mankiewicz, was paid as much as $3 million to step in and save the production. Because of that, the first version of the film ended up being over 6 hours long. Test screenings made it clear that no human could sit still for that long. The studio demanded cuts, and the film was eventually reduced to 4 hours. That version of Cleopatra eventually hit theaters. With a budget of $44 million, Cleopatra grossed $58 million. According to official reports, Fox received 55% of that total. That nearly marked the end of 20th Century Fox and effectively ended the Hollywood Peplum era. Before Cleopatra, such films often found success, but afterwards, sword and sandal epics started flopping one after another. Sometime in the mid-1990s, with the rise of home video, Fox announced that Cleopatra had finally turned a profit. Ironically, the film that ended the era of traditional sword and sandal movies was called The Fall of the Roman Empire. After that release, Hollywood stopped funding such projects altogether. Like Elizabeth Taylor, Sophia Loren earned $1 million for her role in the film. However, the film cost less than Cleopatra, just $20 million, and grossed only $4 million. The Fall of the Roman Empire is considered the most disastrous Peplum film in Hollywood history. Stephen Boyd, who played one of the lead roles in Ben-Hur and whose career was on the rise in the late 1950s and early 1960s, claimed that this film completely destroyed his career. Alec Guinness, who later played in Star Wars, said he never managed to sit through more than 20 minutes of the movie. The last big-budget film sometimes classified as a sword and sandal epic is the 1966 film The Bible, In the Beginning. With a budget of $18 million, it grossed $34 million. It almost never saw the light of day, but it happened to enter production before Cleopatra and The Fall of the Roman Empire hit theaters. And although it's considered a failure, Fox officially reported they lost less than $2 million on it. Compared to Cleopatra or The Fall of the Roman Empire, that's almost nothing. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, television made peace with Hollywood. Films that once premiered in theaters were now being bought for good money to be shown on TV. Hollywood studios started getting involved in TV series production. Audiences started to see the difference again and returned to theaters. As a result, there was no longer a need for a huge number of expensive, large-scale productions, and Peplum films were shelved. But as we all know, history repeats itself. And although sword and sandal epics were declared dead in the 1960s, they came back in the early 2000s. This time, thanks to the success of Gladiator. However, the revival didn't last long. After the failure of Alexander and the underwhelming performance of Troy, the genre faded into the background once more. Maybe in 10 or 20 years, another Gladiator-like movie will come along, and will once again be flooded with tales of swords and sandals. But that time hasn't come yet. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned.